Hello, welcome to Performance Anxiety. We analyse the film, television, theatre and comedy performances that everybody is talking about. I'm Alex Dale, and with me is my resident film expert,
Dr. Maren.
on this episode, A24 and Beau is Afraid.
Goodness gracious, how nerdy.
How nerdy, why so?
Talking about a film distribution company.
Well, this is what we need to get into, isn't it?
Yes.
What is A24 and why did we want to talk about it? So, what is A24? I guess those of you who've been listening for a while, if you remember our Oscars episode, A24 had something of a moment at the 2023 Oscars. Can you remember what we said at the time about that?
Basically, they cleaned up at the Oscars. And we said, we need to do an A24 episode.
We certainly did.
Because, why is it that their films speak to the award-giving classes?
The Academy.
Yeah.
The new clerisy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Why does Hollywood love A24 films?
I think that's a brilliant question. Yeah. Why does Hollywood especially love A24? So to answer that question, we're going to ask a few other questions. What is A24? What is it? Why is it? What is it about? And we're going to use Beau is Afraid, which is their current movie that's in the cinemas at the moment, as a brilliant example of what A24 stand for, the way they work, the way they look, the kind of films they produce, because it is a very representative film of a particular kind of attitude and aesthetic, I think.
Yes. So what we have probably discovered is that they speak of this very historical moment in time for a very particular class of people.
Interesting. Okay.
Right? But what does that mean and how did we get there? I think this is what we want to explore.
All right. Let's think about A24 for a minute. Would you care to summarise what you understand A24 to be?
Well, A24 started out as a film distribution company. It was founded by 3 New Yorkers in 2012. So it's just 10 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not even a Hollywood production company. They're New Yorkers, they're East Coasters.
Ah, interesting. Already a distinction worth mentioning.
So what they saw, I think, was a gap in the market for... they are our generation, Generation X, and we grew up with things like indie and alternative, music and films and the kind of anti-establishment.
The idea of an underground.
Yeah, the counterculture.
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true, sad to say.
Yeah, and so this is that was a real thing, sort of, especially, till the 1990s. But they thought... we need indie films because the indie films that were produced in the noughties, so from 2000 onwards, they were produced by big Hollywood studios. They were not real indie, they were not real alternative. And they were also quite uninteresting. They were quite twee. There were all these kind of, about manic pixie dream girls. It was, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. That was the kind of indie that was alternative cinema at the time. So what they said, we are interested in interesting films and interesting filmmakers, and we want to promote new and interesting ideas.
Films with an attitude or an edge, something different.
Something different. So what they started out as, it was a film distribution company. Hollywood films are either produced and distributed by the big studios, like Sony or Disney, and they produce the films and they market the films. So they've got completely control about this kind of product that they put out.
So that is one of the questions I had is distribution is very nerdy, as you say. What does that actually mean? What is a distribution company? It sounds like a kind of glorified middleman or something. Is that fair?
It probably is, yes.
How do they end up being, winning Oscars and stuff,
Yeah.
I guess, is where we've got to get to.
I think
from humble beginnings, what is this?
Absolutely true. So this distribution company is this kind of middleman between the playhouses or the show element of art and the production element of art. But as I said, most big studios have their own distribution built into them. So Disney does its own marketing. So it's in control of the kind of advertisement that comes out for its films, the trailers, the kind of tours and the premieres and so on and so on.
And they approach the cinemas and the cinema companies and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Is
exactly.
that right?
So big companies will already have deals with cinema chains.
I see.
So
I suppose if you're an indie film, you don't necessarily have an immediate cinema to go to.
Exactly. So little production companies, they don't have big deals with cinema chains. So what they need is somebody who sells their product to cinema chains, and that's the distribution company.
I see.
And they also take on the marketing.
So A24 wanted to get small, interesting films into the cinemas.
Exactly. That was their aim. And they came up with this beautiful marketing strategy in that they were the first ones who relied on social media to do the marketing for them. Social media was emerging, and they started, seeing this as the way of cheaply bringing the films to the people.
I see.
Don't forget, the new audiences were, our generation, Generation X, and especially millennials, the first generation that grew up with the internet and the digital natives of Generation Z.
I see.
So these were the new customers for their films, and they were the ones who would use social media.
All right. Let me read you a list here, a partial list of the films that they've been involved with, starting with stuff that they've just been distributing and then moving on to stuff that they've produced over time. The film that really put them on the map, that made their mark, was Spring Breakers in 2013, famously starring James Franco and a bunch of other people.
Well, it was the Disney kids, Vanessa Hudgens and Selena Gomez.
Aha. Yes, I remember the poster. Well, I'm shallow, but I remember the posters, right? So it's these bikini-clad women and James Franco.
Yes. Well, I remember because I was doing my PhD at the time, and it was like the film that made ripples throughout the department, and people were saying, oh my God, this is such an important film.
Interesting indie film.
Well, I think that there was an important moment here in that it was a kind of film that really set the tone of what A24 was going to be about, their audience, and the kind of aesthetic that they were going for.
So they really hit the ground running with this thing.
Yes, because the one thing about the film was that it was extremely, what we now call memeable. At the time, it was just getting sort of likes, But now
thumbs up.
But now it is what we describe. It's memeable in looks and in aesthetic, and it is a film that thematizes this new generation that grew up as digital natives. It's the first film that seems to look at their very specific problem and their specific form of alienation.
So we're talking what? Millennials, Generation Z? Kids born in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
The Disney kids.
Yeah. So that's millennials, yeah.
What would you describe as that particular kind of alienation? What are we talking about?
At the time, of course, it was you grew up at a time when, the kind of ideological wars were over. They lived in this post-ideological age.
So what we're talking about is the end of the Cold War, 1991, and then there's this period of very boring stability where ideological contestation, that kind of left-right conflict, no longer exists.
Exactly.
Or is muted or dampened down or, changed.
It's the first generation that grew up in this kind of alternativeless world or political desert, so to speak.
There's no this or that. It's just this in the middle.
Exactly. And the deadlock of politics. Not that they even experienced the deadlock of politics. It's that there was no politics and it was the new normal. And in the film, we had to have a lot of drug taking, for example, as a kind of way of dealing with this alienation. People who don't even know why they're so alienated.
I think this is going to be a recurring theme as well.
Absolutely. But it sets the tone for A24 very nicely.
So content, aesthetic, audience, themes. It's
stars, performers, they are already in there with recognizable faces. They promote films with established faces or popular faces.
That's interesting.
In a reimagined way. Reimagine stars in a new way.
Yeah.
This is kind of an important idea here.
And you can see that in their CV here, and this is a partial CV. As you say, Spring Breakers, the Disney kids, followed immediately by The Bling Ring, starring Emma Watson, Hermione, if you watch the Harry Potter films. Obvious Child in 2014, starring the comedian Jenny Slate. Ex Machina was very famous for the special effects and won awards. Slow West, starring Michael Fassbender, again a big star. Room in 2015, Brie Larson won Best Actress for that performance. The Witch in 2016, that was the formation of Anya Taylor-Joy as a star.
And Robert Eggers, the director.
Swiss Army Man in 2016, that was Daniel Radcliffe.
Again, it's all the Harry Potter kids getting street cred, isn't it?
Laundering their personas, I think. In 2016, they had their first self-produced project, which was Moonlight.
Won immediately an Oscar.
So you can see they have this Midas touch somehow. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
In 2017, they produced Lady Bird, which was the founding of Greta Gerwig's career, or introduced her as a director at least. 2017, The Disaster Artist, that was James Franco's pet project. Things get really interesting in 2018 with Hereditary.
Yeah, Ari Aster's first film.
Now he's going to be a big deal in our conversation. Because in 2019, they produced Midsommar, which was also Ari Aster. In 2019, they also produced Uncut Gems, which helped rehabilitate Adam Sandler's career. And then things get really massive in 2022 with Everything Everywhere All at Once, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, Bodies, 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 Pearl, The Whale, and that is the year that they clean up at the Oscars. So between being formed in 2012 and the 95th Academy Awards, they'd already received 49 Academy Award nominations, winning 16 in all, which is quite an achievement. And in 2023, they were the most nominated single studio that year. 18 nominations between 6 films, and they won 9 of those nominations, including Best Picture for Everything Everywhere All at Once, and All the Performance, and The Whale.
Well done.
Oh, yeah.
But you can see they are Hollywood's darling, and we can find out why that is. So A24 is this kind of new way of doing movies, and they produce a lot of movies. They actually produce more movies than Paramount, for example, in any given year. But a lot of the films go straight to the streaming services. We actually don't know about them. The famous ones are the ones that you hear about. But, the old saying, quantity affects quality. You just produce a lot of stuff and, the good stuff will stick. And that's a good motto that they went by, and it pays off.
So they're a powerhouse, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they're punching very much above their weight, I think.
And it's become this kind of cult thing to like amongst the kind of media classes.
Among the cognoscenti, for want of a better word.
Yeah. So you can become, you can subscribe to their newsletter, and you can actually become a member of A24.
What does that mean?
You basically sponsor the films. You don't get access to the films early.
Okay.
But
well, in that case, I'm not interested.
Yeah, it's like being a member of the ICA or something.
I see.
It's like, bleh. But it's cool.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
They have a lot of merch, and a lot of very cool merch that people collect.
Yes. So apart from their marketing, which is basically memes and social media events, their merch promotes these kind of memeable elements of the film.
And memeable stars like Mia Goth, for instance. Everyone loves Mia Goth. I don't know why. She's just an actress like any other. But you can see how the memes catch on.
Exactly. So the stuff that works virally or, on TikTok is the way that they market themselves. And this explains why certain stars are really, really famous, but only to a certain group of people. If you went to your mom or so, asked her, "Oh, have you heard of Mia Goth?" She would have said, "No." These are the stars for a selected group of people who are online, not boomers, not uncool people, right?
So we're getting to the nitty gritty, I think, of what makes an A24 film, the contours of this thing, what kind of films they produce, films with an edge, films with a slightly quirky attitude, not standard Hollywood films, but also simultaneously films that Hollywood love. And things that catch on among a particular kind of, I was going to say self-regarding audience, but that might be a bit harsh. But certainly people who like to think of themselves as being discerning, let's say.
Yeah, and I think, Hollywood likes to think of itself as self-discerning.
They love to slap themselves in the back, don't they? They really do.
But we also have to understand the history of Hollywood. And, what we used to understand as Hollywood cinema was the way America sees itself. The self-mythologizing of America was exemplified through Hollywood films. There used to be films that were often quite artistic, but also they would be about Americans, where Americans saw their own ideology reflected back at them. Right?
So this is kind of the frontier myth, for instance.
Yeah, but also, conservatism with like the small c, this, Americans done good. People, things like Forrest Gump or even American Beauty or Dances with Wolves. We had a kind of overlap of what Americans liked and what Hollywood liked. These kind of things were synonymous.
When you say Americans, you're talking about the kind of the viewing public,
yes,
right?
the greater public. So what people went to see in the cinemas or
Yes.
spent their money on, that they would talk about, that was a kind of social event in America. And what Hollywood also would reward.
So there was still a sense that you could be artistic and have some kind of artistic merit, but also be successful enough to be a blockbuster or at least get a lot of people through the door, right?
Yes. And interestingly, with the end of history that we mentioned earlier, there came also a divergence between the audience of Hollywood movies and, what Hollywood liked, what got rewarded and got Oscars. So from sort of the 2000s onward, the popular films were big blockbusters, the franchises, the Harry Potters, the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Marvel movies, the Lord of the Rings films.
Yeah. Remember those days? My goodness.
Yeah. So the naughties, so to speak, these were the money-making films. And then the indie films were the ones I talked about already, produced by big Hollywood studios. They were kind of quirky, but not very interesting,
What, like Jarhead or something, or what?
The war on terror was a big subject, but also, as I said,
it was just the first one that
things
came to mind.
that would star Zooey Deschanel, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
500 Days of Summer. Okay.
Yeah, so you get my drift.
Yeah.
So they were quite meaningless. They were cute and they were nostalgic.
Yeah,
And they were
but fluffy.
quirky, fluffy. Yeah. They weren't substantial. They weren't very interesting.
So are you saying that there was a kind of vacuum there that A24 identified?
Absolutely. I think the 2008 crash, together with this new generation of millennials who knew nothing of political strife, their only experience of the world was constant fear that something's going to happen, something apocalyptic is going to happen, but nobody knows what it is. Constantly, everybody's in a state of panic. Everything's terrible, which then sort of found its biggest expression in 2016 with Brexit and the Trump vote, where most liberals completely lost their minds and could not understand why this is happening. The chaos was complete.
Mm-hmm.
Total ongoing catastrophe.
So you're talking about a rift between the kind of creative classes. I hesitate to say the elite because it's a very contested term, but the people in charge, the tastemakers, the cognoscenti, the clerisy, whatever you choose to call these people, there is a definite upper strata of society.
Yeah.
And there was a division between them and the broader section of the population, the plebs, for want of a better word again.
Well, whatever you want to call it, however you want to divide it, you cannot deny that there has been a kind of real cognitive dissonance in understanding why Trump happened and why Brexit happened amongst the kind of people who run institutions. And there's no willingness to understand it either. But instead, it seems to be there is this kind of constant fear that the world is breaking down and that there's something there in the atmosphere that's just there about to get you. Right?
Yes.
But you don't know what it is.
Part of a general sense of the end of the world, a malaise,
Yeah.
a rudderlessness, directionlessness.
Yeah.
We're not living in particularly optimistic, forward-looking times. We're living in particularly divided times, angst-ridden times, fearful, divided, individualized, individuated times, I think. Is that what you're driving at?
Absolutely.
All right, that's a lot of ground we've covered there, I think. What do you think is the relationship between the historical moment that you're talking about, this particular paranoid, fearful moment we're living through, and A24 films in general, and Beau is Afraid in particular? maybe start with some obvious questions like, what is Beau is Afraid? Let's just describe it so that people have a sense of what it's about and what it's like.
Okay, so Beau is Afraid is Ari Aster's third film for A24. A24 produces a lot of horror movies, or what we would understand as horror movies. And Ari Aster's previous two films, Midsommar and Hereditary, are very, very successful horror movies. And if we go by the idea that horror films can tell us about our contemporary fears, A24 horror films are a really good source for this. And Ari Aster's Beau is Afraid would fit into this pattern. Beau is Afraid is the story of Beau Wassermann, who is a kind of Jewish professional son, played by Joaquin Phoenix. The story is simple. It is basically Beau gets the message that his mother has died and he has to go to her funeral. And the problem is he cannot get there.
Yeah, the whole movie is basically a series of obstacles in his way, right?
Right. It is a horror movie in that it is a kind of real nightmarish version of this kind of Hollywood hero's journey.
Yeah.
He has to take the symbolic journey to get to his mother's funeral. And the journey in itself is a freaking nightmare. He cannot get there. He is being stabbed, kidnapped, shot. Everything's against him to get to this funeral of his mother, who in the end turns out not to be dead, but just testing the love of her own son. It's kind of, messed up.
Spoiler alert.
It's not really a spoiler. But it starts off in the nightmarish world that Beau lives in. He lives in a city and it's chaos. It is an absolute nightmare of a place to live in.
At first, I thought it was just a hair's breadth away from being a realistic depiction of San Francisco, honestly. It really does summon up very well the genuine chaos on some of those very underprivileged streets. There's just homelessness everywhere, people sleeping rough, people openly taking drugs, naked people running around. They heighten it in the film, so there's like a dead corpse that's just in the middle of the road. No one bats an eyelid, but it's only marginally heightened. It's not too far away from it.
The thing is, you could imagine this to be real.
Yeah, you could. It's not an exaggeration.
But it is the kind of nightmare that you live in this chaos and nobody helps you. You're absolutely helpless in this really Kafkaesque scenario. You get robbed, you get murdered, you get stabbed, and the police does nothing. On the contrary, it just shrugs their shoulders on as part of the whole problem.
Or it threatens you, in fact.
Yeah. So this is the world Beau lives in, and this is how he has to negotiate getting to his mother when you can't even leave your house without being, attacked. And of course, he is played by Joaquin Phoenix. What is his star persona? What does he perform?
Well, famously, most recently, he's been the Joker.
Yes.
But the role that implanted him in my imagination, which I don't think he's ever deviated from, was in Gladiator.
Yeah.
So he plays, I think the character is Commodus, I think.
Yes, Commodus, the ruler of Rome.
Yes.
A psychopath, basically. Yeah.
So very famously, in the first scene, he says, "My father told me the qualities of what makes a good man and a heroic man, and I realized I had none of those qualities." So that's pretty much Joaquin Phoenix to a T. Is I'm the opposite of a hero. I'm not brave. I'm not noble.
Yeah. Also unhinged.
Yeah.
And you can see in his public performances as Joaquin Phoenix, he always comes across as a bit unhinged, even for Hollywood star standards, right?
Yeah, that is saying something.
Yeah. So in The Joker, he plays this kind of incel, helpless, powerless man, right? Who, again, lives in this chaotic world in which he cannot take any kind of control, or which does not want him.
Which you can't understand. It's beyond comprehension a lot of the time.
Yeah, so the world works in ways that you have no way of either influencing or understanding even, right? And same with Beau. Beau is, what Ari Aster says, he's a loser.
Yeah, so this is 3 hours long, this film, and it's basically being what it feels like to be a loser for 3 hours. So we had different personal reactions to it. I was really put on edge by this.
I fell asleep. I just couldn't be asked.
So there we are. There's a small insight into our personal proclivities. But the big picture remains.
It is about the idea of being, not able to stand up for yourself for whatever reason, to be meek. This is what Joaquin Phoenix symbolizes to many people. This sort of way you become unhinged if the world doesn't make sense to you.
Well, the theme, I think, that's common to Aster in particular, and maybe to A24 more generally, is it's like that old saying, I'm not interested in politics. But maybe politics is interested in you. So the idea that something out there has a plan for you that you will not understand, but it's not benign, it's malevolent.
Exactly.
And it's got it in for you,
Yes.
and you'll never know what it is.
And this is where we can make the connection to the other Ari Aster films, Hereditary and Midsommar, which is about people being shoved into worlds where malign powers set up arbitrary rules that you will never understand. You will always get it wrong.
This is the unique kind of alienation that Ari Aster is, I think, expressing or describing, almost in spite of himself, is in the past, you might have understood what you were alienated from. But I think this is almost to the point where you're alienated from something and you don't even know what it is. It's so beyond your comprehension. That's the horror element in the thing, right?
Exactly. And this is why it freaks out this particular class of people, and it speaks to them.
This is why they're going for it.
Yeah, this is why it's the Hollywood darling, because this is the nightmare they're living through. A24 articulates the Hollywood classes, so to speak, nightmare. It cannot comprehend the world in which populists want what they want.
Yeah. And why the public behave by their rules so irrationally.
Exactly. It makes no sense. It is a threat that is incomprehensible. And this is why it's so on the money there. And this is why it's so popular, because these films very cleverly pick up this historical moment and talk about it and solve it in different ways. So Ari Aster's is about this kind of horror element, Ari Aster's films. We have other films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is also all about this kind of alienation and how complicated life is, and that, these kind of multi-dimensions symbolizing the kind of incomprehensibility of one life as such, which the only way out they fathom is empathy and understanding.
And be kind.
Being kind,
yes.
Right?
I don't think even understanding, honestly. I think that's asking too much.
I would probably agree.
Yes. The only option available to us is just not to be mean to one another. That's the best we can hope for.
Or in the horror scenarios, it's being a psychopath, taking drugs, seeing a shrink.
Essentially losing your mind.
Losing your mind, yeah. So you either lose your mind or you take drugs, or, you just be kind. This is the world that...
You numb yourself, I think. I was reminded of Freud, weirdly. I didn't think I would be, but I was. And the way that people cope with trauma, you distract yourself, you numb yourself. I can't remember the others because my reading of Freud is very shallow. But you can see how that kind of idea that they're coping with trauma in a very therapeutic and psychological way is definitely there. So our question really, we had several questions, but our question ultimately was, why is Beau is Afraid a perfect example of an A24 film? What is in it? So if people wanted to watch an A24 film, would you recommend it? And if you did, what would you tell people to expect? What can they hope to get out of it? Is it worth engaging with?
So A24 films definitely captured the zeitgeist. They are really talking about what is important at the moment. So yes, engage with them. It is useful. I didn't get a lot out of Beau is Afraid.
It's not an enjoyable experience, particularly.
It's not made for me. It didn't make me really anxious because I don't have this paranoia and this fear of others, right?
Yeah.
Or the world, or the history, or the future. I don't have that. So it leaves me cold. But, as I said, A24 produce a lot of movies, and they give their filmmakers total creative and artistic freedom. So by sheer default, they must produce something that will shine a lot of truth on something in a very entertaining way.
Yeah.
And I think it was Bodies, Bodies, Bodies for me that really captured a truth about how people live today in a very amusing and entertaining way. So it was really good in speaking to me about the contemporary constant fear that people have and what it leads to. I'm not going to spoil this one, but watch it. And
Yes.
it really, really is a good exploration of people who are constantly afraid and what it will lead to and what kind of happens to your mind when that happens.
If you want to understand the creative imagination at the moment, for better or worse, probably worse in this case, but if you want to see it given its full force and full free expression, A24 is the place to go. You might not enjoy it because it might be horrific in some way, but at least it's a kind of honest and sincere expression of something real, a real fear that's out there, maybe.
You might not be of that mindset and it might not speak to you, but there are really useful exploration about what is happening and how people are thinking about the world. And the artistic language of A24 films tells you also a lot about the historical moment that we're in and what is important to people and how they see and want to be seen.
Thanks for listening to Performance Anxiety. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please like and subscribe and spread the word. It really helps. Give us a 5-star rating if you are so inclined. Till next time.
Tasha, you're giving me performance anxiety.